Since the end of the last decade, the global economic outlook has been deteriorating in several domains, from the increase in CO2 emissions and the COVID-19 pandemic to permanent disruptions in parts of the supply chain. Increasing security concerns in various parts of the world, from the Indo and Pacific regions to Europe, signal worsening conditions since the February 2022 military invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the return of war to European soil.
Bem-vindos outra vez. Vamos retomar a conferência. Vamos agora para o segundo painel. Vou-vos revelar um segredo que está aberto a todos. Nos 4 painéis que nós temos, participam 16 palestrantes, dos quais 4 deles são meus colegas de diferentes universidades, a quem eu solicitei que fizessem o tal papel de orador, mas ao mesmo tempo moderador, ou seja, são os 4 portugueses dos painéis. Os outros 12 são estrangeiros, e são estrangeiros de 12 nacionalidades diferentes. Não fizemos de propósito, mas a nossa ideia no clube foi trazer pessoas que normalmente nós não vemos todos os dias nos nossos jornais, nas nossas televisões, nos nossos canais. Ouvirmos, portanto, vozes diferentes que venham de diferentes lugares. É o caso. Este segundo painel, Segurança no Indo-Pacífico, que no fundo são 2 regiões, 2 grandes regiões, analisarmos um pouco a questão da conflitualidade e a relação entre a conflitualidade no Indo-Pacífico e a guerra na Ucrânia. Vamos ter neste painel, começando pelos nossos convidados que estão e fizeram o favor de esperar um pouco online, uma em Tóquio, outra em Kuala-Lumpur. Começando por eles, Jomo Kwam Swandaram tem, volto a dizer, as biografias deles estão expostos no nosso site, nas nossas redes sociais, e eu vou unicamente destacar que Jomo foi e é muitas coisas, é um pouco, como se chama, multitask. Escolhemos colocar que ele é académico visitante no Kazana Research Institute e foi antigo diretor-geral adjunto das Nações Unidas. Ele, portanto, vai-nos falar a partir de Kuala Lumpur, julgo eu. Jomo, muito obrigado por estares connosco. Yoko Ivama.
Muito obrigado.
Yoko Ivama, nacionalidade japonesa, estamos a falar de Tóquio. Ela foi, eu não conheço, é a primeira vez que vi, foi há pouco, agora mesmo em online, estive a falar 2 minutos com ela. Yoko foi-nos sugerida por uma amiga nossa, japonesa também, que foi aluna dela, aliás. Yoko é professora e é diretora do programa de Estudos Estratégicos do Instituto Nacional de Graduação em Estudos Políticos, em Tóquio. Ela vai estar connosco online. Yoko, thank you very much for being with us. Aqui connosco presencialmente vamos ter Richard Higgott. Richard Higgott é uma espécie de questão do Indo-Pacífico, que é exatamente o caso. Muito obrigado, Luís. Eu passo-te a palavra e pronto, o resto, do ponto de vista da organização, sabes tão bem como eu. Muito obrigado a todos por estarem connosco mais uma vez. Até já.
Obrigado, Fernando. Bom dia a todos. Queria começar por agradecer, em nome da Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa, a oportunidade, mais uma vez, o Clube de Lisboa nos dá para nos associarmos a uma iniciativa tão relevante. Lembrar que temos tradução simultânea nas duas línguas, português e inglês, razão pela qual peço desculpa aos nossos convidados, mas vou falar na nossa língua conforme combinado. Devo também dizer que sou muito adverso ao conceito de Indo-Pacífico. Aliás, porventura depois discutiremos isso mais adiante. Mas se chamemos-lhe Indo-Pacífico, chamemos-lhe Ásia-Pacífico, como eu prefiro, devemos todos entender a região de uma forma mais limitada do que aquilo que a União Europeia faz, infelizmente, na sua estratégia para o Indo-Pacífico. E seja qual for o conceito que utilizemos, esta região reúne todos os fatores de insegurança, como nenhuma outra região no mundo. Só para dar alguns exemplos, é bom recordar que foi nesta região que tivemos proliferação nuclear desde o fim da dupla Guerra Fria. A Índia e o Paquistão em 98, a Coreia do Norte desde 2006. É bom recordar que todas as potências residentes têm fronteiras indefinidas por disputas territoriais com países vizinhos. Índia, Paquistão, China, Vietnã, Filipinas, Malásia, Taiwan, Coreia, Japão, Rússia. Temos grandes hotspots que perturbam a segurança e estabilidade internacional. Caxemira, as várias disputas territoriais entre a Índia e a China, o Mar do Sul da China, Taiwan, Península Coreana. Graves problemas de segurança ambiental, segurança económica e energética. Mas, e essa é porventura a minha primeira questão, temos um paradoxo, porque há anos que os especialistas escrevem e dizem que no século XXI assistiremos à balcanização da Ásia-Pacífico, ou do Indo-Pacífico, que o século XXI será nesta região o que foi o século XX na Europa, isto é aqui que teremos o início das novas guerras mundiais, e curiosamente o que discutimos hoje é uma nova guerra na Europa, não nesta região. E por isso passaria a palavra aos nossos outros convidados, perguntando-lhes qual é a explicação para que no meio de tantas rivalidades, tanta competição, tantos problemas de insegurança, tantas disputas territoriais, esta região consegue manter uma relativa paz. São razões, explicações de ordem cultural, são de natureza geopolítica, é da diversidade dos regimes políticos que resulta esta situação paradoxal. Qual é a razão para que se consiga manter uma relativa paz por aqui? E já agora, se me fizerem o favor também de quererem dizer qualquer coisa sobre o próprio conceito do Indo-Pacífico, eu sei que o Richard o vai querer fazer, estejam à vontade. E para alternarmos entre o presencial e o online, eu se calhar convidaria Jomo Sundaram para, em primeiro lugar, dizer algo sobre estes aspectos que lancei para a mesa. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you, Fernando, for this invitation. Allow me to make some preliminary remarks. I think the idea of the Indo-Pacific is not very new. It basically unites two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And this idea goes back at least a century, at the time of a German thinker who basically came up with the idea of the Indo-Pacific and tried to prove it, and basically tried to suggest that this would be an alternative way of thinking about the world, so that they would not support the West versus Germany and later Japan. I think so. This idea is not terribly new. I think the whole idea of thinking about spheres of influence in terms of oceans goes back, as you all know, from the land of Prince Enrique the Navigator. It goes back more than 5 centuries. The whole, as you know, with the Treaty of Tordesillas, the world was divided between Spain and Portugal, initially through the Atlantic, and later also allowing Brazil to be under the influence of Portugal. Now, the current role of the Indo-Pacific is to extend the role, the previous emphasis, which was started with Wolfowitz in 1992, and later on with Obama, when Obama talked about his so-called pivot to Asia. The idea basically was to isolate China. So in a sense, what has happened recently with Russia invasion of Ukraine is a bit of a distraction in terms of the Indo-Pacific. The thinking about it in Washington is very, very hazy. And there was a meeting which was essentially an ASEAN meeting of the Southeast Asian heads of governments. And these leaders were invited to Washington. They did not even have the courtesy of a one-to-one meeting with President Biden. And at the end of the meeting, basically, it was announced that they would be part of the Indo-Pacific community, and also Indo-Pacific economic framework was announced. If you look at the economic Indo-Pacific framework, it really offers very, very little, besides some standardization of norms. It doesn't even offer some trade market access, for example, to the US market. So this is of even less interest to many countries in Southeast Asia, and arguably beyond Southeast Asia, because it has very little to offer to these countries. These countries desperately need market access. They need lack of discrimination and so on, and this is a major problem. So the whole idea really is to bring the Indo-Pacific in as a big framework for the integration of the region, to also include India. Because so far, the various initiatives have been East Asian and have not really involved India. There was an attempt to involve India in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, but India withdrew from those negotiations a few years ago, and so that India was kept out of it. So the focus, so there have been various attempts since the Quad and a number of other initiatives to involve India in the encirclement of China. And this is just the latest, but there is a sense in the region, in Southeast Asia, that this is a two-tier system, that the first tier involves not only the US, but also the UK and Australia through the AUKUS arrangement, which of course upset the French a great deal. So what we see is that even among the US and its NATO allies, there isn't a unity of purpose around the Indo-Pacific strategy. But that is the world in which we live right now. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Obrigado. Richard?
And you see how words become fashionable. So let me start by asking, what's in a name? And the name that we've used as the nom du jour, if you like, is Indo-Pacific. But as Jomo has pointed out, there have been lots of incarnations previously. I, for example, was in a School of Pacific Studies at the ANU, that then became the School of Asia-Pacific Studies, Then we began to talk about East Asia and East Asian symmetry. We had a stage of talking about the Pacific Rim. And the idea of the Indo-Pacific, as Jomo points out, has been around for a long time. And it's only in the last few years, though, that it's really become, can I use the word trendy? Fashionable again. And has indeed, Jomo noted, Obama discovered it with his pivot to Asia. The crucial change is that the Indo-Pacific as a concept is basically a concept of security regionalism. Much of the discussion of East Asia and the Pacific prior to that, through things like APEC, through things like the creation of TPP, that Obama, of course, saw as a way of, indeed, as Jomo says, keeping China out of the economic activity of the region. But of course, Donald Trump, in his classic strategic genius, withdrew the United States from TPP in his first week in office. So that didn't travel much after that. The other thing I think is to think about the idea of the Asia Pacific as a Western perspective on it. And the one thing I want to say is that the reason that we've moved from basically focusing on the political economy of the region to the strategy of the region is explained in several ways, and I want to briefly explain them. One is what we might call the economic explanation, and the other one is what we might call the political explanation. The economic explanation I describe as what I call the global distemper. I'm sure we all know what distemper is. It's a very viral, contagious disease that domestic dogs often get. Now, the features of this distemper, the global distemper, are quite simple. They're the backlash against globalization, the rise of populism, nationalism, and identity politics, the accompanying backlash against democracy, a backlash against a rules-based order, and of course the changing nature of US-China competition. The important thing here is to see the way in which US-China competition has changed if we want to explain what's happening. You could say that it started with a simple trade issue when Trump wanted to basically see the balance with China basically taken down dramatically. But we've moved through that to a system of what I call the weaponization of or economic warfare, the language of economic warfare. And now this didn't end with the Biden administration. The Biden administration might be slightly more discursively sophisticated and less crude in the way that it presents things, but basically the strategy has continued along the same line, and indeed it's been beefed up. So now artificial intelligence, digital competition, and of course the forthcoming chip war and increased military preparation has all progressively contributed to the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic understanding of regionalism as opposed to an economic understanding of regionalism. Let me say this, though. We are not in the US-China competition seeing Cold War II. It's quite fashionable to call it Cold War II, but it's not. It's different. Cold War I, the boundaries were discrete. In Cold War II, the boundaries are fuzzy. The notable difference, of course, is that China is structurally much stronger as a part of a truly interdependent global economy than Russia ever was. And one of the great myths that we had as a scholar of international relations was that growing economic interdependence would reduce political and security tension in the world. This has not happened. And technological independence between the United States and China is potentially offering us the greater prospect of more conflict than the relative autarky of the two blocks of the Cold War did. The level of interdependence of the US and China leaves more room for economic warfare than was the case during the Cold War. So we have what I call a fuzzy, bifurcated world order, not what John Mearsheimer, the great American realist, calls two bounded, distinct orders. There's too much leakage in the current fuzzy binary. And the two superpowers view mutual interdependence as a vulnerability, not as a strength. The decoupling process, which is now underway, is creating frictions. It's not lessening frictions. And the frictions are not only between the two superpowers, but between their allies or countries in their areas of influence that are forced to respond. Secondly, on the military strategic issue, there is a major difference between the initial Cold War and the current US-China military composition. Military rivalry in the current era is primarily naval and primarily in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, if you must. But military contest at sea in Asian waters, opposed to on a European landmass, is likely to pose less of an existential threat to either state. It's much less likely that Chinese leaders will risk all-out war if some of their ships are destroyed, given the nature of the military complex and the way it behaves in the Asia Pacific. And I want to finish this area, this section, with a question. Do we really want China to fail? If you watch what's happening in United States policy over the last 2-3 years, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, I mean, we know it's in the latest national security strategy, that it's not simply about containing China, it's about downgrading China's global standing. My response to that is we should be careful what we wish for. I do not think we want that. And someone raised the interesting question in the last session about whether the US had become a spoiler. I think in some ways there are two different games the US is playing. In Europe, Biden's winning all the way around and he's done incredibly well. And his foreign policy has been extremely impressive. I'm less sure that US policy in the Indo-Pacific can be rated as highly on a score out of 10 as what's being done in East Asia. So what I'm going to do in my second intervention is I'm going to talk about the Quad and I'm going to talk about AUKUS. And as I'm probably the only Australian in the room, my reading of AUKUS may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you who think that this is the great savior of military security in East Asia. I think that is a problem that we have. One last comment. I think the other thing that's destabilizing us, ironically, is this juxtaposition of democracy versus autocracy as a way of trying to identify who's doing what. And the recent Munich Security Conference saw the US pushing this for all it's worth. And again, as with the question of do we want China to fail, and I don't think we in Europe do, but I think certain sections of the American policy community do. But I also think, as with that question, the positing democracy versus autocracy may not have the responses that we want. And I think we need a note of caution there as well. Thank you.
Obrigado, Richard. Yoko, passo-te agora a palavra.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, do you hear me?
Sim,
So
perfectly.
thank you very much for inviting me. I would have very much liked to be there in Lisbon, but I'm talking from Tokyo, 9 o'clock in the evening. So when you have a concept, you have probably everybody claims to be the author, and I'm going to do that. Not me myself, but I'm going to claim that Japan was actually the originator of the idea of Indo-Pacific. For us, this idea is very much bound up with the political figure that dominated Japan, at least for the last decade, and this was Shinzo Abe. Now, he had two chances as a prime minister. The first try was 2006 and 2007. The second chance he got was from 2012 to 2020. And he was very much the author of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. And we Japanese consider that this was really the concept that made the idea of Indo-Pacific very popular. The Americans picked it up, found it very useful, and it has gone through three successive American presidency, and they are still using the same concept. There were moments when they kind of deviated and went to other concepts, but we just insisted on using the idea Indo-Pacific because we find it very useful for several reasons. Now, so it's useful to go back and see where did it come from? Since when did Shinzo Abe use this idea? So when he had his first government in 2006 and 2007, this was still very much an embryo stage. So there was this idea of the confluence of the two seas, meaning coming together of Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. Prime Minister Abe was a very nationalistic person, I think. He wanted Japan to be self-sufficient, confident, flourishing again in the middle of Asia. And he belongs in a tradition in Japanese politics, insisting on sort of very much Japan-centered nationalism, regaining its own constitution and its own identity, and regaining capability of defining its own security. So it's kind of pulling back the gravity from the middle of the Pacific Ocean towards itself, putting itself in the center of the world. So you have both Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. But his first government was very short. He resigned for health reasons, and he came back again in 2012. The first idea that he reintroduced was Asia's democratic security diamond. And he stuck to this idea for a while, this diamond idea, which is lives on in today's Quad. This was the 4 democracies of Asia. He had this idea in his head. I think he was very much fascinated by country India. I mean, it was partly strategic, of course, to balance China, but again, this kind of shifting the center of gravity and balancing it with the more Asian proportion, I think was in his mind. So Asia's democratic security diamond was the first version. And then in 2016, he comes up with the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, why a new idea? Because he shifts the gravity even further east. This time he brings in Africa. It was at the occasion of the conference TICAD 6. This is TICAD is a series of conference the Japanese Foreign Ministry have been doing for years to they virtually bring together all the African countries and have a huge conference to decide the priorities of development aid. So TICAD with African countries, he opens up this idea of free and open Indo-Pacific. So now he has this map in his mind where you have the Pacific, you have the Indian Ocean, and you even have the African continent on the edge. So this is really the map that Shinzo Abe draws in his mind as the 21st century map of the world, where he places as a true Japanese nationalist, Japan right in the middle of it, which can sort of pivot the balance the way he likes. I mean, in an ideal world. So geographically, this is sort of Asia plus Africa and Pacific Ocean plus Indian Ocean. Now, this is kind of intentionally fuzzy and ambiguous idea. And I think that's really the point about Indo-Pacific. You don't really know where it starts and where it ends. Whereas Europe, you have always lines drawn by institutions like EU, like NATO, and you're either inside or outside, you're with us or against us. Well, at least that's how Putin has defined it. And he's defined that whoever is in NATO is against Russia. The concept of Indo-Pacific intentionally avoids drawing lines. It also avoids defining itself in one or the other way. This is intentionally the Japanese way of defining security as a comprehensive security, not only military, but also diplomatic and economic and social. So when we talk about free and open Indo-Pacific diplomacy, it is not only about military, it's also about civilian, it's also about social, it's also about legal things that come together. It's even about cultural things, I think. Everything can be put into this basket, and that's the kind of usefulness of the concept. We intentionally try to present it as a cooperative idea, not against anyone for competition purpose, but as a framework for cooperation with whomever wants to join us. So it's intentionally fuzzy and ambiguous, and it's avoids drawing lines. So it's a kind of multitude of overlapping networks and partnerships. So now that's kind of really adapting to the reality of the region, because for a person doing security, when I talk with the Europeans, repeatedly I confront the idea of why don't you make NATO of Asia? And that doesn't really function here because we try avoid drawing lines. There are many countries in the region who wants to keep open the relationship to both US and China and try to avoid choosing one or the other as long as possible. And making NATO and asking, do you want to be a member in that, is the last thing they want to confront. So I think I'll stop with there. The idea of Indo-Pacific, although it does have the challenge that China poses to the region as one of the central tasks that it has to overcome, it is intentionally vague about it, and it is intentionally ambiguous about what form it takes and what method it uses. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Obrigado, Yoko. Eu gostava de pegar aqui nas palavras do Richard e sublinhar a falácia que é a divisão entre democracias e autocracias. Acho, aliás, que é uma mensagem errada que a partir dos Estados Unidos e da Europa se propicia acho que é pouco atrativo e é repulsiva para outras partes do mundo, incluindo na Ásia. Dos que apoiam militarmente a Ucrânia, apenas 32 países o fazem, de todo o mundo. Se juntarmos ao apoio militar, o apoio militar e financeiro, apenas 36 países o fazem. E não estão todos os países do NATO, não estão todos os 27 da União Europeia e nem sequer estão todos os participantes no grupo de Ramstein. Se pegarmos nas resoluções, nas 5 resoluções que foram votadas na Assembleia Geral das Nações Unidas, concluímos facilmente que há uma condenação muito grande da Rússia, porque quase uma centena de países votaram a favor de todas essas resoluções, incluindo o Afeganistão dos Talibã ou o Myanmar da junta militar. E se pegarmos naqueles que se abstiveram em todas elas, nós temos várias democracias, vários membros da Commonwealth, temos países que, portanto, não são propriamente autocracias. Uma sondagem do European Council on Foreign Relations, realizada em 15 países nos meses de dezembro de 2022 e janeiro de 2023, desses 15 países, 9 eram da União Europeia, os resultados são elucidativos. À pergunta sobre o que é que a Rússia representa para o seu próprio país, 77% no Reino Unido, 71% nos Estados Unidos e 66% da população da União Europeia disseram considerar a Rússia um país rival ou adversário. Na Índia, 80%, na China, 79% e na Turquia, 69% disseram, as opiniões públicas, ver a Rússia como um aliado ou um parceiro necessário. O que significa que, obviamente, não estamos a falar de uma dicotomia. Autocracias, democracias, as visões são muito distantes e nós percebemos que há aqui um grande interlocutor, que são os Estados Unidos, que, do meu ponto de vista, atuam na Ucrânia e contra a Rússia, tendo por objeto e alvo principal a China. E creio que a China, entretanto, entrou numa lógica similar, que é de assumir a Ucrânia não como uma guerra na Europa, é posicionar a China como um peacemaker global, é evitar que a Rússia seja derrotada e enfraquecida, porque é fundamental na competição global com os Estados Unidos. E, portanto, tenho para mim que a guerra na Ucrânia entrou numa fase em que tanto se pode transformar numa paz por procuração como numa guerra por procuração, Estados Unidos, China. O Richard queria dizer umas palavras sobre o Qual e o AUKUS. Eu acho que são dois instrumentos que dividem a área euroatlântica e que dividem a Ásia-Pacífico. Eu creio que a proposta de paz ou o plano de paz chinês tem como um dos objetivos dividir os países europeus, dividir a aliança transatlântica e promover poder de atração na Ásia-Pacífico ou no Global South, como entendem. Mas voltando à ordem que seguimos anteriormente, sobre estes assuntos ou outros, passaria agora a palavra a Jomo Sundaram, de novo. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Luis. I must acknowledge that Richard is far more, he has spent much of his career working on international strategic issues. So I would defer to him. And I think he correctly pointed out that it is international strategic considerations which have been foremost in the articulation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. the articulation of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it seems almost like an afterthought. And if you look at the so-called 4 elements of the IPEF, India has rejected one of them. That means trade liberalization. But none of the 4 includes market access. So it is not at all attractive, unlike the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which at least offered market access. But this was deemed unacceptable, not only by Trump, but also, I must emphasize, by Biden. Biden is not interested in any kind of trade liberalization either. And I think it is important to recognize that we are talking about a very different United States, and a United States which has a very different sense of its own vulnerabilities and its own interests. Richard Higgott, whom I referred to John Mearsheimer. I think John Mearsheimer has been distinguished by his criticisms of the American involvement and engagement in the war against, let me put it differently. He has been distinguished by his criticisms of the American attitude towards the Russian invasion. He sees the role of the Americans as being very provocative, going back to the time of Gorbachev and so on and so forth. I would not go into all those details here, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I think it's very important to recognize that Mearsheimer is not a pacifist. Mearsheimer wants the US to concentrate exclusively on China. Okay, so we are basically talking about his dissent is about fighting on 2 fronts at the same time, whereas he would prefer that the US concentrate on China. So we are looking at a situation where the perception, the lines which have been drawn against. It is essentially a question of China. Now, Iwama-san was absolutely correct that it was Abe Shinzo. I want to emphasize Abe Shinzo because Abe Shintaro, his father, had a very different view about how to improve relations in Asia. But Abe Shinzo has been distinguished for many people in Southeast Asia by his remilitarization of Japan, and is not particularly much appreciated, not only in China, but also in Korea, as well as in other parts of the region. The current Prime Minister of Japan, Nishida, is not as enthusiastic about being direct antagonistic towards China as Abe Shinzo was, or perhaps even his successor, Suga. So we are talking about a situation where a view which was revived from the Second World War, a legitimization device of linking Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean, has been revived now for current purposes by Abe Shinzo, but it serves a particular purpose. And Mr. Kurt Campbell, who is seen in Washington as the man who has been articulating the Indo-Pacific strategy, Kurt Campbell was also the one who first articulated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we are recognizing, on Mr. Campbell's part, a recognition that TPP has basically failed and it is necessary to develop an alternative strategy. So we are dealing with a very, very dangerous situation where the major belligerents are outside of the Southeast Asian region. Okay, and if anything, Southeast Asia is surrounded by belligerents. Okay, and this is where I would like to hear very much from Richard Higgott, who has been thinking about these issues, as he says, for over 4 decades. But here, I think it is important for us to recognize that as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, and as far as much of the rest of the global South is concerned, there is very little sympathy for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But having said that, there's also a broad recognition that this Russian invasion was to some extent provoked by NATO and its leader. And this, I think, is part of the reason why there is a relatively little sympathy for the NATO efforts currently. Now, the question then becomes, why is much of NATO and much of Europe joining in the efforts against China? There seems to have been, in recent months and recent years, increasing difficulties in their relations with China. Europe used to be distinguished from the United States in terms of its antagonism towards China, and the situation has changed very importantly. And I suspect this is part of the reason why this conference has been organized. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Richard?
Thank you. Let me say that I agree with everything that Jomo says, but I wouldn't want people for 1 minute to think that I'm some kind of Mearsheimer sinophobe who thinks that the invasion of Ukraine was brought about by the United States. I don't. But I do think that some of the things that are happening and the descriptions that Jomo has just given us are absolutely accurate in the East, in the Indo-Pacific context. Let me just say a little bit about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and then AUKUS. It's very difficult to distinguish when American policymakers are talking about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and the continuity that we've seen from the time of Tillerson. For those of you who can remember him, he was the American Secretary of State who was fired by, I don't know whether he was fired or resigned, but he and Trump finished up with very bad relationships. He envisaged the whole of the Indo-Pacific from the east coast of Africa through to the Pacific seaboard of the United States as the Indo-Pacific. But that was tightened in the US. Mattis, for example, the Defense Secretary, made it quite clear with the 2017 National Security Council NS report, the only one that came out under the Trump administration, that the Indo-Pacific was but a subsection of wider American security strategy and needed to be seen as that. And that the principal idea of the Indo-Pacific was to give priority to a theater, i.e. the Indo-Pacific, where they could maintain superiority over China. Other actors who are part of the Quad have different views. Australia has very much taken on a view of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific that now reflects that of the United States. It didn't used to, but it does now. And sadly, I believe that part of this explanation is to do with the craven way that the previous Liberal administration in Australia threw in its lot with the Trump administration. The Morrison administration was very much part of that kind of ideological perception. India, of course, sees it differently. India sees it as a chance to make itself a great power player in the Pacific region in the face of growing Chinese intrusion. The French have a view of the Indo-Pacific that also includes the Southern Ocean. It includes the Indian, the Pacific, and the Southern Ocean because it wants to protect its Antarctic strategies. ASEAN's position has been explained nicely by Jomo to the extent that they have both an Indian Ocean position and a Pacific Ocean position, and they treat the two separately. The other voice in this debate, of course, and I say, and it sounds like I'm moaning about everybody, but I'm not. But I say this again in a sad way, is what I would call the cliched British attempt to be part of the Indian Ocean action, part of its idea of being global Britain, and also this obsession with the Anglosphere. And that brings me on to the issue of AUKUS. AUKUS, as everybody in here probably knows, is a trilateral security agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, announced in 2021, late 2021. At its core, its long-term aim is the provision of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia on the back of US technology and British production. What makes it interesting is it's the first piece of hard empirical security activity as opposed to security dialogues. The Quad is chat, the other activities in the region are chat. This is actually a firm piece of a security initiative rather than dialogue. At its background, it should be noted that opinion in Australia, and Australia is the key bit of this because it's in the Indo-Pacific, the key element of this is that opinion in Australia is divided. Now, you wouldn't know this because mostly you get your media from Australia, from the Murdoch press, which actually, believe it or not, dominates the Australian media more than Murdoch and Fox dominates the American media. And if I can be allowed a free, one of the nice things about being emeritus professor is you don't really care what you say. You're much less diplomatic in your old age than you are when you're still a tenured professor with a career to make. But in some ways, the Murdoch press in Australia is even more insidious than it is in the United States. And the Australian newspaper has led the China threat argument in Australia. And that has been particularly influential. But most of Australia's senior security specialists have very severe concerns about AUKUS. So on the one hand, AUKUS supporters refer to it, and I love this euphemism, they refer to AUKUS, and I quote, as a technology accelerator agreement. Makes no discussion of its defense capabilities or activities, but it's designed to allow countries to work closely, again, and I quote, for the purpose of translating the promise of today's maturing technologies, such as quantum computing and AI, to give a military edge. And of course, supporters of AUKUS point to the insecurities and vulnerabilities in the region, and they play up Chinese aggression in the region. By contrast, critics in Australia say that it's basically a provocative pact that could destabilize the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. It has no deterrence function, and it's been I think it was Jeremy pointed out, it was one of the more shameful exercises in duplicitous diplomacy of the Australians towards France that badly damaged Australia's international diplomatic image. But AUKUS needs to be seen in the wider context, and that context is basically the way in which the ANZUS alliance between the US and Australia has provided the United States with a forward position in the Asia Pacific. And it should be noted, for those of you who are not familiar with it, that even though it's called the ANZUS Alliance and it's a treaty like NATO, there's no Article 5 in the ANZUS Alliance. There's no guarantee of automatic defense. Let me just finish by saying none of this is necessary. Australia's geopolitical distance from the South China Sea and from the East China Sea, and China's limited naval capabilities in distant waters, I stress distant waters, should have allowed prudent Australian foreign policy makers to distance it from the region's territorial conflicts, and to do so without jeopardizing national security. That way, Australia could have still contributed to US-China cooperation and to the restoration or support for regional stability. It didn't need to be part of this process. So in short, AUKUS is an empirical example of what could be a destabilizing activity in the region. And I have to put my hand up and say, not everyone would agree with that, but that is my reading of it, and why I made the comment that I think that the Biden administration's role as an exogenous actor in the Indo-Pacific looks a lot less responsible and a lot more hawkish than the role that it's, I think, appropriately played in Europe in the last 18 months. Thank you.
Obrigado, Richard. Yoko, de novo para Tóquio. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Right, so Russia is an interesting topic when you go back to Abe Shinzo. He tried to act the role of the best friend of Putin. So I think Vladimir Putin was the foreign leader he met most. Now that had a very nationalistic reason. Japan still does not have a complete peace treaty of the Second World War. We have no peace treaty with Russia, and we still have the territorial dispute, the Northern Territory. Abe Shinzo wanted to go into history book as the person who finished the Second World War completely, settled the dispute, and concluded the chapter. And for that reason, repeatedly he met Vladimir Putin. Now, in the end, he did not achieve his goal. So we still have no peace treaty with Russia. And I don't really think we have any hope of seeing that possibility in the near future. That was already clear before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is very important. Most of the people had sort of given up hope for the time being that there's something you can do with Putin's Russia in order to solve the territorial problems and have a peace treaty. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, Japan was very much ready to, together with the European countries and other G7 leaders, to condemn Russia's invasion and stand on the Western side, the NATO side. So Japan's position has been really the strongest of all non-European countries in politically, at least, supporting Ukraine. And we have done a lot economically and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Not much military assistance, but that has been in the tradition of Japanese foreign policy. And also I think we are too far away to really be a significant provider of arms to Ukraine. Now, having said that, it is interesting that under Prime Minister Kishida, who, as Jomo-san correctly said, is far more middle, sort of not very nationalistic, not militarist person, happened to be the Prime Minister to redefine Japanese national security strategy. We released our 3 security documents December last year, in which for the first time in post-war history, Japan clearly defines its security in military terms and emphasizes that it is very important that a country has the military capability to defend itself on its own. It's clearly spelled out in the document that it needs to do so on its own. Unless you do it on your own, nobody's going to help you. We never clearly admitted this like that. So in a way, this dovish Kishida has kind of come into the role of remilitarizing Japanese national security. Now, how would a Prime Minister Abe, if he had lived on, redefined national security if he was alive today? I think things might have turned into a different direction. We all know the tragic incident that happened to Prime Minister Abe. This last spring, the last issue that he had raised was that of nuclear sharing for Japan. And there was a brief several months when Japan, for the first time in post-war history, very serious people debated pros and cons of nuclear sharing for Japan. In the end, we've decided this is nothing for us at the moment. But I think if former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was still alive and he was an active participant in this debate, maybe the debate might be still going on. Interesting thing to note is how South Korea is quite different from Japan currently. South Korea, in comparison to Japan, has not that much sympathized with Ukraine. It tries to kind of keep out of the way. Now, this Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a very interesting moment for academics in Japan like me. In the past 1 year, it has been kind of 1 year continuous resurgence of Europe specialists and continual decline of most of the Russian specialists who tried to define it in the way Jomo-san just did, that Russian invasion was actually provoked by NATO and by NATO expansion, and that you had to kind of understand the point of view of Russia and try to work for some sort of armistice. So public opinion debate in Japan and in media also has been very interesting. Formerly quite liberal newspapers also kind of changed positions gradually towards the sort of G7 mainstream attitude. Whereas in South Korea, the attention has been really directed towards the resurgence of North Korean nuclear capabilities and its buildup of nuclear weapons. And now they are kind of loudly claiming for at least some sort of nuclear sharing on the Korean Peninsula, maybe restationing of American tactical nuclear weapons, or even development of its own national nuclear capabilities. So this is the direction that's kind of the Korean public opinion is running. I've heard that more than 7% of Korean population supports some sort of nuclear capability for its country. This is not so in Japan, but it's a kind of a really interesting contrast that's been taken. Again, back to the 3 national security documents, although it is more militarized than ever, it is still very much tries to keep in line of comprehensive security, multilateralism, And insofar as it's multilateral, it remains in the framework of partnerships and especially US-Japan division of labor in security, meaning that we keep accepting the extended deterrence of United States as credible, and we remain in conventional capabilities, and we do the part insofar as it's possible in that domain. So this division of labor has been kept, and I think that really kind of defines the fine difference between the worldview of Abe Shinzo and Kishida Fumio. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Vamos fazer aqui a nossa última reunião, a última ronda pelos oradores, mas eu gostava de, nesta última oportunidade, antes de passarmos para o debate, tocar dois aspectos. Um deles prende-se com o Quad e o AUKUS, que eu acho que são reflexo de uma tendência na região para o minilateralismo. O minilateralismo é uma resposta às enormes limitações do multilateralismo na Ásia-Pacífico. Nós assistimos desde o fim da dupla Guerra Fria a uma proliferação enorme de organizações, mecanismos e organismos de todos os gostos, regionais, subregionais, interregionais, pan-regionais, mas na verdade, como muitos descrevem, são essencialmente talking shops. Falam, mas de concreto pouco resolvem. Depois há uma outra questão que é o sistema de alianças dos Estados Unidos na Ásia-Pacífico é o sistema de segurança da Ásia-Pacífico. Não existe uma NATO, não existe uma OSCE, não existe uma verdadeira União Europeia. Para compensar, surgem vários mecanismos, os tais minilateralismos. O AUKUS ou o Quad é um exemplo. O Pacífico Quad, em que está a França, é outro exemplo. Os muitos mecanismos de diálogos trilaterais, os 5 Eyes mais 3, os 9 Eyes, os 14 Eyes, tudo formas de compensar. Tem vantagens porque são muito flexíveis, ninguém abdica de soberania nem de competências, mas tem os riscos que o Richard apontou a propósito do AUKUS. É que os minilateralismos excluem mais do que incluem. E os excluídos não gostam de o ser. A segunda nota é para falar do elefante na mesa, que é Taiwan. É impossível, na região e no mundo, olhar a China. Indicações de quem manda. Não é chinês. Mas é impossível não olhar para a segurança na região e para o quadro atual da intervenção, da invasão russa na Ucrânia, sem olhar para Taiwan. Eu acho que o presidente Biden cometeu um erro estratégico no início da invasão russa, quando disse que os Estados Unidos e a NATO não iriam intervir, porque a Ucrânia não é membro da NATO. Mas esse erro estratégico, como percebeu que era o pior sinal que podia dar para Pequim, foi compensado a seguir, dizendo que os Estados Unidos iriam intervir caso a China fizesse uma agressão similar contra Taiwan. E isto levanta um problema que é: a Ucrânia é um país soberano, membro das Nações Unidas, tem direito à integridade territorial e, para todos os efeitos e para a esmagadora maioria dos países, Estados Unidos incluídos, Taiwan não é um país soberano. Eu creio que há um problema sério que devemos ponderar nos próximos anos, que tem que ver com o facto do presidente Xi Jinping assumir como desígnio completar a unidade da China pela integração de Taiwan. Ele assumiu publicamente que era um desígnio dele que não iria deixar para os dirigentes seguintes. E há uma urgência de tempo, porque na Taiwan democrática nós temos dois grupos com dois movimentos partidos políticos e visões distintas. Uma defende a identidade chinesa e a união com a mãe-pátria China, o Kuomintang. A outra é dos taiwaneses e defende a independência de jure de Taiwan. Demograficamente, Os taiwaneses estão a aumentar e os chineses em Taiwan estão a diminuir. Democraticamente, o tempo corre contra a vontade dos que querem a união como em pátria. Há muito poucos dias, a CIA fez sair um relatório dizendo que a China vai atacar Taiwan até 2027. A minha dúvida é se os Estados Unidos irão, nesse caso, se irão verdadeiramente agir militarmente ou não. E a minha resposta é de 50% para cada hipótese, porque se não o fizerem, é o fim do sistema de alianças dos Estados Unidos, da credibilidade do sistema de alianças dos Estados Unidos na Ásia-Pacífico e no mundo. Mas qual é o presidente dos Estados Unidos que toma a decisão de arriscar uma guerra total com a China para salvaguardar 23 milhões de pessoas de um território que não é soberano, pondo em risco outros tantos ou mais milhões de norte-americanos? Perguntava aos meus colegas de painel se querem acrescentar algo, umas últimas palavras antes de passarmos ao Q&A. Yoko? Jomo? O Richard já me disse que não. You want to say something more? Yoko? Ok. Então vamos para as questões.
Yes,
Yes?
just a word about Taiwan. I quite agreed with Professor Higgott when he said that Australia is distant enough from South China Sea and, of course, from Taiwan to kind of quietly sit aside and watch. You didn't put it in that way, but I think that's what you meant. No, we're too close to Taiwan. So we're very tense. And we're preparing. All we want is peace, really. And I think that's the impression many people got from Ukraine. Once you let the fighting start, it's very hard to control and it's very hard to end. And you really don't know which way it will go. So really, Taiwan Strait, what China will learn and what US will learn from that, we're not really sure. We're really watching and thinking, but it's only all a guessing game. And so we will do everything first to deter and then encourage for dialogue. I really think something like OSCE in Asia, where we really confirm the principle of peaceful change. Nobody denies one China or even one Korea, but please no war for border changes. And, you watch the map and see where Japan lies, be it Taiwan Strait, be it Korean Peninsula, it is really close. The fire will just pour over us if it breaks out. So we want stability, we want peace, we don't want war. But there's this phrase in National Security Document that we've discovered that globalization and trading alone won't bring peace, that we have to prepare for war as well in order to deter war from starting. So, we're really close, and I hope the Europeans will understand that. Don't think we're warmongers, we're not, but we're close enough that we have to prepare, that we have fire brigades in place when something breaks out. Thank you.
Obrigado, Yoko. Comprovadamente, nem os membros do Quad se entendem sobre o verdadeiro significado e o impacto. E dois membros relevantes que, ainda por cima, o Japão depende em 25% do comércio com a China, a Austrália depende em 33%. Richard, quer dizer alguma coisa? Please go ahead.
Oh, just 30 seconds. I agree entirely with my Japanese colleague about proximity and distance. I don't think Australia should be either pacifist or isolationist. My position is simply that I'm not sure that it contributes to regional stability by the manner of its relationship with the United States, and that it could make a greater contribution to regional stability by actually becoming more of as under certain administrations it tried to do, to become a much more serious Asian partner, even knowing that it could never be an Asian partner in the full sense of the word, than being seen basically as a junior partner in a wider American initiative. It's always going to be difficult, but I think that the current position is not contributing to regional stability, whereas being a good regional citizen in other ways could be.
Obrigado. Então agora sim vamos abrir questões para a audiência, comentários. Pedia naturalmente que fossem bastante breves e dirigiam ou a algum dos membros do painel ou para o conjunto do painel. Um microfone ali, por favor.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, I would like to start by saying that I deeply appreciated your concern with the concept, the fuzzy concept of Indo-Pacific. But even more, I appreciated your introduction of Taiwan to this discussion. And that's where my question is going to come from, because I think what Taiwan exemplifies for this region is that while at one level the region consists of very diverse countries and groups of countries with very different political and security interests, they all share a common economic interest. And that is exemplified by the intense trade that takes place between Taiwan and China and all the East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, all of which are closely integrated into the global supply chains. And that includes the semiconductor industry, where we have Taiwanese personnel working in Chinese companies until now. So my question really is, it's about the United States abandoning its leadership of the multilateral trading system and going forward and disrupting the trading system, and finally trying to disrupt and reshape global supply chain. And my question really revolves around the fact that global supply chain incredibly complex relationships of flow of finance, ideas, people, made by thousands of people, different people. Is it possible to reshape these flows and relationships, which have been motivated by economic? Can we now, in the United States, reasonably, effectively, efficiently reshape these relationships to conform to these geopolitical goals? And if it pursues this goal, as it seems committed towards, what are the likely costs to the countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia, who are so closely integrated with each other through these economic and trade relations? Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado. Tínhamos aí atrás já outro pedido. Atrás.
Answering to your request that to be brief, I will be very brief. I think one of the questions that you are facing, and for a long time ago, is that, I mean, you are maybe overreacting things in a very Cartesian way. I mean, you are balancing interests and values. And when discussing Asia, sometimes I think you oversimplify things and you tend to answer with our, let's put it like that, way of thinking way of proceeding. And I suspect, I have no quick answers, but I suspect that the question one is much more complex than we in this side think it is. Thank you.
Bom dia, eu gostava de fazer uma pergunta que sai um bocadinho daquilo que tem sido a narrativa até agora desta sessão e que é o papel, ou como é que os participantes no painel veem aquilo que foi definido como a estratégia de cooperação da União Europeia para o Indo-Pacífico. Se quer faz sentido a existência deste documento no âmbito da União Europeia, e sendo o conteúdo tão abrangente e geral, qual é a interpretação que os países da região têm do conceito da União Europeia para o Indo-Pacífico?
EU strategy on Indo-Pacific. Mais uma?
Thank you very much. I'll introduce myself also for the benefit of those online. I'm Rosa Balfour from Carnegie Europe. Following this latter question, how is the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy viewed? I was going to ask it just a bit more broadly. Is Europe, is it viewed at all, especially for the panelists who have joined us online? And then, a bit of a broader question as with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 10 years from now, how will this be viewed? Is it, has it served as an accelerator of existing trends, an unnecessary accelerator, I would argue? Has it been pushing sort of global confrontation in a certain direction? And if that direction is China swinging further towards supporting Russia, how is that viewed in the Indo-Pacific? Surely not in their interests, which then leads me on to the question, why is it that it is so hard in some parts of Asia to see this not as a conflict between two equal partners, i.e. Ukraine and Russia, but as it is a Russian aggression of Ukraine, of a sovereign state. And therefore, going back to what we were talking about in the earlier panel, why this sort of sitting on the fence on part of some countries and this openness to interpreting the war with certain justifications which don't stand up to reality. I hope that was clear.
Ok. Temos aqui, se calhar, Richard, começamos agora por ti. Escolhe todas as questões que quiser responder.
I will choose certainly the first one. I think it's quite clear that the United States is now having significant influence with its decoupling process. But you asked whether it could be effective and efficient. My argument is no. It's happening. There is decoupling taking place, and it is also encouraging China to respond in a similar fashion. China has always, with its 2025 strategy, wanted to have much greater autonomy over a whole range of production processes. But the reason it's difficult for the US to decouple effectively and efficiently is because China is so central to many of the world's major global supply chains. I'm sure that Jomo can give you a better answer on that than I can. I'd like to say something quickly about Rosa's question. It's the obvious question, and I would be dishonest if I said I was not disappointed by many of the less than enthusiastic responses in the region to, for want of a better expression, the Western attempt to rein Russia in. The question of learning that you posed, I'm of the view that what's happened in Ukraine will slow China down. It will not speed it up. And of course, Xi Jinping doesn't go out of office in 3 years' time. He does have time to deal with it.
Jomo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Luis. Let me first emphasize that I share very much with Iwama-san her preference for peace. I think part of go back to your question, Luis, at the beginning of this discussion. Why has East Asia particularly avoided war? Part of it is because of the terrible experience we have had with war. Wars of colonial aggression, and more recently with the Second World War in particular. The number of people who died in Asia, and I include India as well, was much higher than in Europe. I'm not suggesting that the European sacrifice was not very great. On the contrary, I greatly appreciate what happened, what the Europeans did to liberate Europe in particular. But the experience is a horrible experience. And nobody wants war again, or war-like conditions or aggression. I think it's important to emphasize once again that most of the countries in Southeast Asia have actually opposed Russian aggression in Ukraine. There is no agreement on Russian aggression, but there is a sense that the Russian aggression was actually provoked by NATO. And I don't want to rehearse all the issues again. As far as the first question which was raised, we have seen, beginning with the pivot to Asia, and then with the so-called reshoring, and then friendshoring efforts initially by President Trump, and also supported by Abe Shinzo, to basically cut supply chains. Now, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the major trading partner, every single Southeast Asian country, including Singapore, which is probably the most pro-Western and pro-NATO of the Southeast Asian countries, every single country, counts China as the #1 trading partner. And this is very important for us to recognize. So you have, on the one hand, very selected entry, access to Western markets, especially the US market, and this increasing resorting to sanctions. In Washington, it is referred to as an instrument of statecraft. The word sanctions is not even used sometimes. These are all considered legitimate instruments, even though they are all illegal under the UN Charter. Okay, so I think we have to recognize that there are double standards involved, and this also involves a number of other issues. I think, for example, if you think about what happened with Kosovo, the creation of Kosovo was essentially something which NATO and the US and NATO pushed for and succeeded in doing. Time and time again, we have seen over the last 3 decades, intervention after intervention initiated in the name of NATO. Okay, so these are all legitimate concerns of much of the rest of the world. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that these are some of the concerns. And we also fear the possibility of a very easy trigger to war. If we think about what triggered the First World War and a number of other major wars in the past, and we think about what happened, for example, the kind of thinking which was encouraging President Trump to have a limited war in 2020 before the election in order to do what Mrs. Thatcher successfully did in reversing her electoral fortunes for the 1983 election with the invasion of the Falklands. The response to the Falklands invasion by Argentina, and also the subsequent events where President George W. Bush got re-elected, partly because of the premise of a completely false war, bogus war in the case of Iraq. So without going into the whole history of recent wars, I think many of us are very concerned. Nancy Pelosi didn't do it because of a great love and concern for the people of Taiwan. You know, it was a deliberate attempt to try to demonstrate her credentials as the leader of the, and this is all now very clearly established. So I think we need to understand why Southeast Asia in particular, but I would argue that East Asians in general are very averse to war. Even Koreans are very averse to war. They have been living in the shadow of the war, and I completely agree with you. I can understand why Richard Higgott may not share my pacifist sentiments, but I think the vast majority of Southeast Asians are certainly very pacifist, and they are very committed to creating a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, as the ASEAN leaders committed to half a century ago. Thank you.
Yoko, please.
Okay. Yes. I'm going to read you the first two sentences of National Security Strategy of Japan. It's quite a readable document, not too long, 36 pages, but the first two sentences go like this. The international community is facing changes defining an era. We are reminded once again that globalization and interdependence alone cannot serve as a guarantor for peace and development across the globe. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So that's where we are. I mean, Japan, more than any country, is a trading and manufacturing country, relying on supply chains networked in and around China. But I think we have to admit that this is a intentional creation of American era under certain understanding of the world economy. It didn't come out of, naturally and free, and it's not cost-free. It's a product of certain ideas and American hegemony. And that is now changing. So I think, need to be prepared for different kinds of outcomes that are possible. You have to remember how President Putin weaponized gas in the lead up to the Ukraine war. And, that really brought home to us if you rely too heavily on one source. And that's exactly what Germany did. It relied about 60% of its natural gas on Russia. If you rely too heavily on one source, that's a danger. I mean, that's kind of ABC of investment, really. Don't put all your money in one basket, divide it into 3 or 4. So, the fact that we could invest so heavily in China is a result of certain era, which is now gone. And I think we need to adapt to that era. It doesn't mean that it is all gone, that we are in a new Cold War, Russia, China versus America plus. We're not yet in that world, but we're also not in the 1990s. So we have to take certain precautions. And I think increasingly many multinational countries are taking that precaution, not everyone. So we're still in a transition. And so this Russia-Ukraine war is really going to influence that direction. How far and how fast are we going to move into the next form of world economy, whatever it looks like? And so what choice China is going to make in the coming months is really going to affect all of us. If it decides to commit too heavily on Russian side, that will accelerate the decoupling inevitably. And it might even make this war into a sort of a surrogate war of China versus Russia, China versus US production capability. I hope not. And I hope Chinese leadership would kind of choose wisely and keep a healthy distance from Russia. But that brings up the what was all this Chinese peace plan about? And I think China's leadership is now thinking, how much should we invest in what? Where are our stakes? How should we play this game best? I think it's not decided, but I'm not optimistic either. So I think there's a great fear that this war, by having China invest too much on Russian side, would actually accelerate the decoupling process, which none of us really want. I don't really think even America wants that. But we might end up in that trap. So I think we really need to be careful. Thank you.
Obrigado, Yoko. Só duas palavras finais, até porque uma das questões não foi verdadeiramente respondida. A primeira é a minha concordância com este ceticismo. Eu acho que um dos sinais que a China deu nas últimas semanas, com a sua iniciativa de paz, ao não responder aos pedidos de Zelensky, que se quer reunir com a China para discutir o plano de paz, ao deixar que a Rússia anuncie que Xi Jinping vai a Moscou nos próximos tempos, ao receber agora o presidente da Bielorrússia, a China sinalizou que pode ainda fazer mais em apoiar a Rússia, ainda tem muito mais com que pode ajudar a Rússia e que ainda não utilizou. Não sei se Pequim já está totalmente decidido sobre o que vai fazer a seguir. Eu acho que os grandes atores estão a deixar as coisas em aberto, mas também não tenho a certeza absoluta de que do lado dos Estados Unidos tudo esteja definido. Eu acho que não há uma percepção clara de que a China está disposta a fazer tudo para impedir que a Rússia e o regime de Putin possam ser derrotados ou ter uma humilhação. Basta olhar para o mapa e perceber que a China precisa da Rússia, do respaldo continental da Rússia, de um amigo fiável para se poder concentrar na frente marítima, onde tem as suas prioridades e as suas disputas, os mares da China e Taiwan. Da mesma maneira que a Rússia precisa de um aliado fiável de respaldo continental para se concentrar na sua vertente europeia. E nos Estados Unidos nós vamos ter eleições em 2024, não podemos dar como adquirido que Biden ganhe. Não podemos dar como adquirido que Trump não regresse. Mas podemos dar como adquirido que Xi Jinping vai ser eleito presidente da República Popular da China agora e que Putin vai ser eleito no próximo ano, ou reeleito no próximo ano. Mas não sabemos se a presidente da Moldova, por exemplo, vai chegar às eleições do próximo ano. E nos Estados Unidos está a crescer a onda daqueles que dizem que, como agora, este pacote que o Congresso aprovou de 50 mil milhões de dólares para apoiar a Ucrânia só entre fevereiro e novembro de 2023, muitos dizem porquê tanto dinheiro para a Ucrânia quando nós o devemos utilizar para nós, para nos fortalecermos, ou então para investirmos na vertente do Indo-Pacífico quanto à China. Sobre a questão da estratégia, ou a falta dela, da União Europeia para o Indo-Pacífico. Está tudo mal. Eu acho que é um dos piores documentos que a União Europeia produziu. O título é uma bizarria, porque colocar no título de um documento, lado a lado, a palavra estratégia e cooperação faz pouco sentido. A União Europeia que nunca utilizou em nenhum documento o termo Indo-Pacífico, utiliza-o neste documento. É um documento que a União Europeia precisa de uma estratégia para a região mais importante do mundo, que afeta todas as dinâmicas também na Europa. Finalmente saiu uma estratégia que diz ter 7 prioridades. Quando a gente olha para as 7 prioridades, a dúvida é saber o que é que lá não está. E se está tudo, é porque nada é prioritário, nem nada deixa de o ser. O problema começa porque, se há dificuldade em ter um documento denominador comum a 27, imaginem o que é criar um documento que, para além desse denominador comum a 27, tenta agradar aos Estados Unidos, por isso é que tem lá um Indo-Pacífico, e ao mesmo tempo à China. Depois, para além do termo, que repito, nunca a União Europeia utilizou, ainda hoje, se forem ao site do Serviço Europeu de Ação Externa, tem lá um espaço que diz Countries and Regions. Não está lá o Indo-Pacífico, está lá a Ásia, está lá o Pacífico, mas não está lá o Indo-Pacífico. Pior é a concepção de Indo-Pacífico que a União Europeia apresenta, que expressamente diz que vai desde África Oriental até às ilhas do Pacífico, junto ao continente americano. E o resultado desta largura conceptual é o documento esquecer um longo legado de relacionamento da União Europeia com a Ásia e múltiplas estratégias, e incluir no documento estratégias da União Europeia para a África ou para o Corno da África. E para finalizar, cito quase de cor para verem a bizarria do documento, diz que a estratégia da União Europeia para o Índico se vai basear em parcerias consolidadas com parceiros tanto da Ásia como da África. E que no Pacífico vai assentar no desenvolvimento dos laços com os países ACP, África, Caraíbas e Pacífico. Pior do que isto, era difícil. E a União Europeia precisa de uma estratégia que oriente a sua ação e oriente as suas políticas. É o que é, infelizmente. Obrigado.